I came to Tiruvannamalai 25 years ago, 24 years ago, to be exact. 24 years ago this year, uh, I was living in a Benedictine monastery in California. In our library there, we had books of Saux, all of Saux's books. And one of those that I read in the monastery was The Secret of Aranachala. And when I read that book, I said, when I come back to India, I will come to Tiruvannamalai. I had never been at that point. Then my chance came maybe a couple of years later. Uh, yeah, maybe about 2 or 3 years after that. And I came here first on a pilgrimage that was supposed to be 10 destinations. This was the first destination, and I never left. I didn't
Wow.
even go back to the monastery, stayed for 10 years. That's how it happened. Yeah.
What was so attractive when you read Secrets of Arunachala?
Well, Secrets of Varanachala, yeah. So it's it's Lusso's personal testimony, first of all, about the encounter with Ramana Maharshi and also with the mountain. And in a way, you can say in a way it's a new stage in his monastic career. You could say it like that. Certainly, he was a good monk while in France, but there was something else that he was looking for when he came to India. And I would suggest that that started on a particular day in 1949, just a few months. He arrived in 48 in India in the fall of 48. So within a few months, that Bishop Mendoza sent Jules Motion and Saux to see Ramana Maharshi. And that's when the bottom dropped out. So that was, you could say, a new chapter, certainly, in his spiritual life and in his monastic life, you can say, yeah.
Hmm. Can you remember your first impression when you read this book?
Yeah, well, so the thing about Saux, if you've read Saux, anyone who I know you've read Saux, but anyone who's read Saux, abhishiktananda, the first thing that grips you is the sincerity, the ardency of his faith, the intensity of his search, and that comes out very well in those first pages of the Secret of Aranachala, because in a way he didn't know he'd spent those 15 years while in the monastery hoping to come to India, but he had never been in India before, and so perhaps there was a niggling doubt in his mind: is India all it's cracked up to be, or have I imagined all this? It's possible. But certainly, when he had that experience here, early January of 49, all doubts were put to rest, And he even says it there in the Secret of Aranachala, how he only imagined, he had never experienced that level of intimacy with the divine, you can say. I'm paraphrasing. And yeah. So that's what was attractive for me about that book, is that certainly his Indian monastic career, you could say, his monastic career as it expressed itself in India began here in Tiruvannamalai. Then subsequently, he lived up on the mountain in caves and wrote poems about the Advaitic experience, and in dedication to Aranachala. In the what would you say, in the liturgy and in the mythology of this place, of this, Mahakshetra, that means great pilgrimage site of India, which appears in the old Puranas. The theme is Aranachala as the self, Aranachala as God himself. So Abhishiktananda, following in the footsteps of Ramana Maharshi, penned numerous poems in devotion to Aranachala as the self. Now, in Western Christian terms, what are we talking about? It's just really versifying the beauty of the mystical experience of God as interiority. So that would be the Christian expression, would be the mystical experience of God. But the way he frames it in those poems is the glory of Arunachala as the self, the indwelling divine.
Were you especially touched by reading these poems at that
Yeah.
time before coming to India?
Yeah. And I think in a way, even still now, and I say this with some hesitation, because Ramana Maharshi's poems are revered all over India. It's some of the greatest verses in the Tamil language, and they're mostly dedicated to Arunachala. But if I'm honest, I think some of Abhishiktananda's verses are matching, at least in terms of their theological content, matching in terms of the understanding. They match, they're equal to Ramana Maharshi. Now, Ramana Maharshi's poems certainly have a very deep theological content, but they also meet all the requisites of the classical Tamil poetry. So in that, Abhishiktananda didn't have that, of course, but he really understood what Arunachala is, and it's very evident in that book.
So let's come back to you. Finally, you arrive in Tiruvannamalai after having read these books of Henri Saux. What happened then for you?
Well, I mean, I truthfully, I read the books and was inspired to come and see, but not thinking that I was going to stay here. There was nothing like that. I was under temporary vows in a Benedictine monastery with a life. I was a liturgist. I was one of the cantors there. I had a cell, had all my belongings there, my music, my guitar, my books, everything. So I was coming on pilgrimage to India for 2 months. I had no plans beyond that. I was coming for 2 months, and this was the first place that I was to stop. But even on the first night, I realized, I've got a problem, because I felt the call very strongly, very surprisingly, very strongly. I felt the call even that first night, and I knew it was going to be difficult to leave here when the time came. And in fact, very soon after that, within the even days, I started having trouble sleeping because it was a discernment crisis. In other words, I was expected to go back to the community and to pick up my duties there. And I had a limited time frame to be in India. I had a permission. I think I had a 4-month leave altogether. I'd used up some of that in the US. So my time frame was 2 months in India. And I knew within a few days I was not going to want to leave. And so I had trouble sleeping for about 2 months as it became increasingly clear to me that I was being called to India. So.
And during these days, were you thinking about Henri Saux? His tension, maybe similar than yours?
It's interesting that you should ask that, because if the truth be told, I actually went in. I felt I had a crisis, truthfully, if you want to know the truth, because I was a Catholic religious. I was in formation as a Benedictine monk under temporary vows. I was a practicing Catholic, and now I was in a Hindu community and being blessed by God. So am I imagining all this? In other words, am I betraying my faith by communing and benefiting from the faith practices of people of a completely different faith than my own? Am I a heretic? Those kind of questions plagued me. Then I remembered Saux's crisis. He went through the same crisis. And in fact, if you read his journals, which you surely have done, in English, they're translated as The Ascent to the Depths of the Heart. I can't remember the French title that Panikar gave, but it's the journals that were published only posthumously, only really about in the late 90s. There, if you read those journal entries, they're hair-raising. you realize he was, even he said at one point he felt like he was on the edge of death. The struggle between him, between these two, on the one hand, the Advaitic experience that he had and could not just dismiss on the one hand, and his deep Catholic faith, pre-Vatican II Catholic faith, and they seem to be at loggerheads with each other. So he struggled tremendously. So in that way, Saux came to my aid. Not that in those journal articles he could offer any comfort necessarily, but just to know that someone else had struggled with the same struggle that I was suffering, that was a tremendous help for me. Tremendous, you know.
And how do you feel today with these two approaches of the divine?
Oh, I have no issue at all. In fact, you would probably be scandalized if I told you how that's not an issue at all for me anymore. You know, I mean, many Catholics who thinks no, that should be an issue, but it's just simply not. And arguably, well, not arguably, certainly, in Saux's life, we see it was no longer an issue in his life towards the end of his life.
Can you tell us something about the evolution of your relationship with?
Yeah, well, okay. I mean, really, okay. So in the way, it's funny that you asked it because I never thought of it like this. But of course, I think the way that it became resolved in me is probably the way it became resolved for Abhishiktananda. The one thing that's very clear in Abhishiktananda's writings, he's a contemplative par excellence. You know, he's a contemplative through and through. And truthfully, that has been my call from the very beginning, is the contemplative life. That's why I went to the Camaldalis, because they embraced the contemplative charism within the Catholic monastic orders. Catholic monastic orders can have various charisms, and one of them commonly is the contemplative life. And so that's why I was drawn to the Camaldalis. But that was always my call, and I knew that. And actually, looking back on it now, I know very clearly why I had to stay here is because I intuited then, even if I didn't have the language for it, I intuited that I could live out that vocation to the contemplative life more easily in the Indian setting. And this may not necessarily be a religious issue. It could be cultural. In other words, a culture like I come from the United States, it's not a culture that lends itself very well to contemplative life. Whereas France arguably does lend itself better to contemplative vocation than a country like the US. Now, India far exceeds both France and US, I would argue. So that was huge for me. And that was even in those first days, I knew already that was going to be the argument. In other words, that was going to be the argument for staying in India. So what initially was a struggle, I mean, a deep struggle, a painful struggle, a deep struggle within me about living, if you would, kind of unofficially, a Catholic monastic vocation, living that out in a Hindu religious community, the conflict that created in me, that resolved itself in time, year by year, over a period of years, as the contemplative practice deepened and matured. And then I think there comes a place in your practice where it's like that line, it comes from Thomas Merton. Well, actually, it was in an interview. You probably know this, but one journalist commented on the intimate relationship, the close relationship between Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, and American Trappist monk, and Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese, monk who lived long years in France and died only a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago in Vietnam. And he said, how is it, the journalist asked, how is it you, a Catholic monk, can be so feel such familiarity with a Buddhist monk. You're from two different religions. And Merton just casually said, well, it's because monk is the noun and Catholic or Buddhist is the adjective, you know. And it's so simple as that the monastic call, the contemplative call, is really a universal call. And it's not just monks and nuns. Every human person has this call to some extent. In other words, we have within us, within our own heart, however quietly it may manifest itself or otherwise, we all have this call to the communion with the divine interiorly through our own heart. You know, everyone has that. Even people who are atheists and don't profess any religious faith whatsoever, they have that deeper longing to know in the stillness of their heart, even if they don't have the language to frame it. So it's universal. And I would say that what Merton meant in that statement about monk is that the monk in each of us is responding to that call to commune with the beyond, to commune with the divine through our own heart. And that doesn't really know religious differences or language differences or cultural differences, sacramental differences. It doesn't really know that. It's a language of its own. It's a universal grammar, if you will.
And during all these years, did you stay in company with Henri le Saux, abhishiktananda?
Oh, yeah, sure. You know, well, see, you know, le Saux's ashram is not far from here. It's just a few hours south of where I live. So I go there regularly. In fact, I go there. Well, I was there just a couple of months ago. I was there a couple of times in December. In early December, we had the celebration that you're celebrating now. We had the observance of 50 years since his passing from this earth. So we did a conference there in the first week of December, about 4 or 5 days. So, yes. And now, and also I have friends, like, for example, Bettina Baumer, she comes here each year. Yan Vigneault, who you probably know, he comes here each year. So we have lots of people who are interested in le Saux, or who are actually even scholars of le Saux, coming here each year. And in fact, sometimes when they'll come, either some of the monks from Shantivanam will come up, or Bettina and some of her students might come, or various other people will come. They'll want to go to le Saux's caves on Arunachala. So sometimes I'll accompany them up there. We'll read from Secret of Arunachala, the things he wrote about that particular cave. For example, the Arutpal Tirtha Guha is a very beautiful cave that Abhishiktananda lived in. So yeah. But of course, in a way, le Saux was like the bridge for me. He helped me to connect up these two worlds, my Western world and my newfound Eastern world, or if you want to put it in religious terms, my Catholic life and the life of meditation that I've mostly, in other words, my contemplative life is mostly informed now from the East, and it's because, if we're honest, contemplation hasn't been kept. It's not as current in the contemporary Catholic Church as it was in former centuries. So there's a lot we as Catholics can learn from the East, whether it be India, for example, Hinduism, or it be Buddhism, particularly. The Buddhists have kind of really they shine, in terms of contemplative life, and they have a lot to offer us. So le Saux was kind of the bridge for me between these two. But once you cross over, and once I think you reach that place, sort of, you can say that place like le Saux had reached, you don't need those earlier links that you relied on, like the Buddha talks about you use the raft to cross the river of suffering to reach the other shore. When you reach the other shore, you don't need the raft anymore. Now here I'm using that simile. That simile in the Buddhism is used for enlightenment. I'm not using it that way in my case. Mine was simply crossing over culturally, in terms of theologically, crossing over from my Western background to working in the Eastern, to use the Eastern way of working, And so Saux was greatly helpful in that way for me. However, I have to say, when I went for that conference in December, I hadn't consulted with Abhishiktananda much in recent years. But for that conference, because I was helping to, what would you say, to organize that conference. I thought I need to brush up my Saux scholarship, if you will. So I went in and read what new literature has come out and new articles published and kind of brushed up, And then when we had that conference, the talks that people were giving in the discussion, everything, the spirit of Saux just permeated that conference. It was incredible. And for me, it was like the Upanishads, the way that Saux embodied the spirit of the Upanishads, that came out very strongly in that conference. And as I told one friend of mine, I came back from that conference and I couldn't sleep at night. I would wake up in the night and those Mahavakyas from the Upanishads would be rolling around my head, and you feel the spiritual current, a la Saux, that that he and the Upanishads that came through him, it would keep you awake at night in the most beautiful way, not insomnia, just exhilaration, So, so the answer is yes and no. I think Saux never gets old, never. And for me, what was interesting about kind of retooling for that Abhishiktananda conference in December of last year, going back and reading Saux, I realized, oh my gosh, there's so much here. So I think I'll read Saux all my life. I don't think it's like, I've read Saux, done that, and you put those books on the bookshelf. No, because it's open-ended, because it's coming from the heart. It's not theological in a scholarly sense. It's theological in a deeply spiritual sense. And that's what he was aiming for. And boy, did he not succeed in bringing that about. Yeah. In his own life, and also for those of us who are enjoying the fruits of the path that he followed while he was here.
When you say there is so much, can you sum up this so much?
Well, I'll just say it like this. What the so much is that Saux is, his heart is fully open. And so the Upanishads, in other words, when he quotes the Upanishads, he's not quoting from memory. He's quoting from inspiration. And it's almost as though his reflection on a quote, in other words, maybe he does take a quote from the Upanishads, from a book, but his reflection on it is as deep, is as much of a Mahavakya, a great saying, they say in India. A Mahavakya means a great saying that if you remember that saying and refer to it ever so often, it will lift your heart, lift your spirit. So when Saux, and pick any book, pick his essay on sannyas that comes in the further shore, pick his essay on the Upanishad that comes in the further shore, pick quotes from the Secret of Arunachala or from the journal. And when he reflects on a line, a Mahavakya from the Upanishad, what he says about it is as great as the Mahavakya itself. Now, how many people can do that? How many people are in touch with their own heart and with the divine? I don't know anyone, truthfully. I don't know anyone. To me, in the English language, when I read Saux in English, that can be, in some cases he wrote in English, other cases he was translated from the French. When I read Saux in English, to me, that is about the most inspiring literature that I've ever come across. Now, you can find lines in Meister Eckhart that are equally great. Easily, you can find. But Saux, almost consistently, I think there's only there's only one book of his that doesn't meet that criteria. You just pretty much all his books, maybe a couple books don't quite measure up that way to that level. But that's the highest expression of spiritual literature, you know, for me. And see, I think what makes Saux, why maybe he hasn't gotten the place of a Merton or even some of the middle-aged saints yet, it's because people don't understand it. It's really intense writing. But in time, you watch his, I expect, my guess is his influence and impact will increase over time because we're just digesting. First of all, we have to digest the language. You know, he's interfacing with the East. We're learning about the East in all kinds of ways, you know. And so I think he can match anyone, truthfully. So that so much is the way he, born of his own inspiration and his own discovery in the moment. You know, it's as though he's writing a reflection on something. And then as he's writing, he has an aha moment. Oh, and then he begins writing on that. And while he's writing, he has another aha moment. And that's the whole way through. He never gets a chance to put in ordinary prose, comment in ordinary prose what's going on, because each line inspires the next. It's inspired. That's the so much. And that's why I don't think you'll get tired of reading Saux, because it's fresh. There's nothing gimmicky. There's nothing repetitive or redundant. Nothing like that. It's the very opposite. It's completely fresh every paragraph, you know.
How is he perceived nowadays in India?
Well, it's hard to say because he's ignored, you can say, generally you can say he's ignored by the Hindu community. Now, I did publish 2 articles in a Hindu publication last year on Saux, and they were received very well by Hindus. In fact, people wanted to read more. In fact, I sent even some digital copies of Saux's books to them because they wanted to read more. So people who people who discover him or read him, naturally they're inspired. It doesn't matter whether they're Hindu and he's Christian. That doesn't matter. They appreciate the value. But I just think generally, perhaps it's because he's Christian, or perhaps it's just he's not around for a long time now. Saux left the body 50 years ago. So, you know, but he's not widely known, you know. Now, imagine, you know, someone like Ananda Coomaraswamy, one of the great scholars of the 20th century, India, you know, when he commented on Saux's Sannyasa essay that comes in the Further Shore, he said, this is the greatest piece of writing on sannyasa ever written in any language. That's what he said. And imagine, he said, it's written by a Catholic monk. Now, to prove his point, you know, like the Divine Life Society, they use that essay in their novitiate training for their monks. These are Hindu monks. They use that essay for their training for novices, Hindu novices, you know. So there is appreciation, but many don't know him. And it's like the same in the West. People don't know Saux. His books have been out of print for a long time, you know. But I don't think it matters that much because he'll live. He's going to live. And we saw, you know, there at that conference, there were people, they were all Christians mostly. We could say almost all Catholics, you know. They were elderly, though. They were older monks and nuns. So, of course, they know Saux in the Abhishiktananda tradition because they know Shantivanam. But it's the Abhishiktananda world is a small world, of course, you know. At the same time, that conference we had in 2010, I don't think you were there for that. 2010 in Shantivanam is in January. And I remember like Paolo Triani, he's a professor, theology professor at Gregoriana University. That's in Rome, where all the popes used to go to seminary, you know. And he did his PhD in Abhishiktananda. And there were other PhD students doing their PhDs on Abhishiktananda there at that conference. So when you have people doing their PhDs in theology at seminaries, including Gregoriana University around the world, that tells you he's got staying power. Doesn't matter if he's popular. Popular means bestseller. I don't think his work lends itself to being popular bestseller. Now, something like Merton's Seven-Story Mountain. Did Saux write a book like that? No, he didn't. He never did. Whereas Bede Griffiths did. Bede Griffiths wrote The Golden String. That's a small version. That's kind of a Bede version of the Seven-Story Mountain. That's popular reading. Saux wasn't interested in that. He wasn't interested in anthologizing his life necessarily. Even the journals, he never had an idea to publish, you know.
So I understand that his legacy is still alive. And so what could be especially relevant in his legacy nowadays?
Well, I mean, I think it depends where you are. But I think for Europe, for the Westerner, the Western Catholic, it's the, for Western Catholics, it's the putting the bite back into religious faith, you know. In other words, we in the West, you can just say this in general, leave alone the Catholic Church, just say Western spirituality over the recent centuries has lost the fire, you know, the fire of faith and the fire of experiential faith, the direct experience of God. That's what we're dying for. That's why so many people are coming to India. It's not that they're dissatisfied with Jesus. It's just like, give me a church with people who are on fire for God, and give me a faith life where I can pursue and commune with the divine on a daily basis. You know, we just still don't really have that. Now, I have to say, like when you talk about the WCC, the World Christian Community of Meditators, they are meeting that need a little bit. There are small things here and there, but it's small, you know, and it's not really mainstream, really, you know. So I think that's one thing for the Western Catholic, or let's say the Western Christian, or you can just say even the Western post-Catholic or post-Christian. Saux offers hope for a vital religious life born of interior search for God. Okay, so that's a highly relevant for our times, for our generation. In India, I think it, you know, he kind of, in a way, he's renewing even arguably, I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but I think he's very much in keeping with the tradition of revitalizing the Upanishadic vision over time. You know, over time, a voice will come along and remind everyone what we're on about on this earth, what the spiritual life is about. Okay, there's many people. Ramana Maharshi is one of those voices, you know. Ramakrishna is one of those voices. Abhishiktananda arguably is one of those voices to me. So that has relevance in India too, you know, not just in the West. So I think those are two things that, you know, it's a uncompromising, relentlessly uncompromising dedication to, well, what would you say? To seeking God within. To seeking God within, much like what the great Christian mystics were on about, you know. So it's a renewal, it's a revitalizing that charism. But it hasn't really been, okay, so there was Madame Guyon a few hundred years ago in France. There's been a few voices over the, but, you know, small. You know, everything, you know, when you think about the Middle Ages, wow, it was packed with great, you know, people doing great work. We haven't really had that since, you know. And as it turns out, we still don't have that. But Saux is one of those, keeping us updated. You know, in other words, like you could in a cynical mode, you could say, well, Christianity's washed up, or religion is washed up. You could say like that. And then someone like Saux comes along and says, no, not at all. It's just gone underground, just needs to be uncovered. So that in itself brings a lot of hope. You know?
Michael, we're arriving to the end of our time. So just one last question. What did you learn personally from Henri Saux?
Well, again, that's going back to really kind of in a way what I already said. In a way that most significant thing for me was that pairing was sharing in the same kind of struggle that he went through, and using his struggle to give me strength to go through a time which was very, very difficult for me. So that was more of a personal thing. But again, I think now, like for example, when I went to that conference and I found myself for several days sleepless, echoing Lissot's words that had come through the various talks that were offered there and the discussion and the papers that were presented. But I think, and I think if for anyone who's pursuing the contemplative life, you learn that's on your own. You don't necessarily need Lissot to tell you, but what he's very good at telling and reminding you is that the divine is available, 100% available right here, right now. Do the work each day and you will not be disappointed, And he lived that truth, He couldn't help himself. He could not help himself. And so I think, I don't know if that answers your question in terms of like learning something from him, but it's that reminder, that reminder, and that inspiration that gives you, that's what made that conference so great for me. It was just like a fresh reminder of what we're on about and what the possibilities are, yeah.
Wonderful, Michael. Thank you so much for sharing your personal experience on the footsteps of Abhishiktananda.
My joy, yeah.
So, yeah. Michael, I'll see you.
Great. Look forward. Yeah. Be well.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good to see you.
Have a nice day.
Too. Yeah. Be well. Be well.